I would like to begin by saying that I'm very grateful for the opportunity to give a lecture in front of such an esteemed audience. Many thanks to the organizers for the kind treatment of my idea of reading. The topic of it will be post-criticism and the departure from the desert. Let's start with a quote that will be crucial to my entire reading. Beyond the desert of criticism, we wish to be called again. In these brief words from his book Symbolism of Evil, one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century, Paul Ricoeur captures a trait followed not only by Thomas Hardy in Afternoon of Christianity, but which foreshadowed a wider phenomenon in Western humanities that we are witnessing today. Word by word, following Paul Ricoeur's metaphor, I would like to show the key features of post-critical term, a contemporary phenomenon that involves philosophical religion, hermeneutics, theology, literary theory, and other disciplines of humanities. It is my sincere belief that the central ideas of Afternoon of Christianity fit into the broader context of the conceptual shift that has been taking place in the humanities over the last 2 decades. There is a deep connection between the idea of post-criticism and what Thomas Hardy calls kairology, the hermeneutics of the experience of faith in history, especially at the crisis moments of social and cultural paradigm shifts. So let's begin with the first part of this quotation, desert of criticism. What is the desert? As Leonard Johnson rightly points out, in Christian tradition, the desert is a richly evocative image. The desert is obviously a boring place, frightening, even life-threatening. Yet in the biblical narrative, it is also a place of call, of revelation, of formation. It is, furthermore, a place of testing and temptation, repentance and reformation, and therefore of reduction, in the sense of being stripped down to the basics. The desert is a part of our journey, and yet it is not our final destination. The desert of criticism is a special kind of desert. It's a place where we have ended up, so to speak, of our own free will. The desert of criticism is a world after the repeated process of disenchantment, banishment of the deities that look after us, forces that interfere with the lives of mortals in a way that is visible to the naked eye. In this, it is a world after the triumphal march of the masters of distrust, Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche, for whom religious existence is a state of artificially sustained immaturity, an ideology of ruling classes, and a muzzle of false morality imposed on the vital and creative powers of individuals. After all, we are all children of the Enlightenment, which Kant described as a way out of the minority into which we have fallen through our own faults. Before ending up in this extraordinary place, the desert, our leading intellectuals were convinced that we persisted in a state of slavery, servitude to concepts and forces that we had not revised to the capacities of our inherent intellect. Enlightenment, as Kant interpreter Michel Foucault has pointed out, is not just a historical era, but a movement and ethos renewed in each generation of distrustful examination of the legitimacy of knowledge and of the power that remains in the implicit relation with it. Enlightenment critique is thus a living project, an effective orientation that cannot be reduced to a set of particular assertions about politics, religion, or science. Contemporary thinkers of post-critical orientation go further in their approach to the idea of criticism. According to them, it is an existential mood, a position taken vis-à-vis the external world, a rhetoric, and a type of intellectual personality consisting of a constant suspicion, vigilance, questioning, skepticism, and distance. It's a constant pursuit of hidden, disguised forces lurking in ambush for our subjectivity, against which the only possible attitude is based on the prefix de, denaturalization, defamiliarization, deconstruction, demystification. The desert of criticism did not arise overnight. It emerged as a result of an economy exercised for decades on concepts and meanings, which led to their erosion, uprooting, excision, and thinning. The practice of critique has not only uprooted the pre-critical landscape of our existence, myths, stories, prayers, but often, to some extent, also the ground on which they were rooted, an openness to mystery, an intuition of existence understood as a gift, a naive fascination with the made world. If the Enlightenment was a way out of the minority into which we had fallen through our own faults, The desert of criticism is an entrance into morbid distrust towards culture of text, faith, philosophy and politics that we've imposed on ourselves. Over the last 200 years, many intellectuals have settled in the desert. Tents have ceased to be a temporary residence on the way to the right place, but a final destination. Fortunately, there were those among us who remembered the promise of hope. There comes beyond. But what if critique were limited, not limitless? If it were finite and fallible, if we considered that it does some things well and other poorly, or not at all? At a certain point, critique does not get us any further. To ask what comes after hermeneutics of suspicion is not to demolish, but to decenter it, to disline, to see it as the be-all and end-all of all interpretation, writes literary theorist Rita Felski in her 2015 book, Limits of Critique. This remarkable thinker, whose long-standing bodied work is embedded in critical and feminist theory, is one of the leading voices in the post-critical term, a broad phenomenon in the contemporary humanities that, as I mentioned, include phenomenology, hermeneutics, theology, and many others. What they have in common is the conviction that the ethos of criticism has not only helped to liberate human possibilities of development from oppression, but has also deprived us of something. It has replaced the plurality of interpretative attitudes and ways of situating ourselves in relation to the world with a compulsion for critical distance, detachment, irony, and suspicion. If you are not critical, and that means critical enough, constantly revising your vigilance against latent forms of violence, then you are certainly, consciously or not, serving the status quo. Post-criticism is a rejection of such hermeneutic paranoia. Post-criticality, which does not seem obvious to everyone, is not equivalent to rejection of the critical method. On Immanuel Kant's 300th birthday, we are not celebrating the final triumph over religious fundamentalism, populist nationalisms, imperialist ideologies, and conspiracy theories. Criticism as a federal formation and ethos seems to have more work and challenges ahead of it than it did even 20 years ago. Post-critic theorists such as Bruno Latour, in his famous text, Has Critique Run Out of Steam?, note that the hermeneutic of distrust, from being a panacea for violence, can evolve into its ally. As an example, he cites the proliferation of conspiracy theories that contradict elementary historical facts, and also the development of instant revisionism. The dust over the shelled cities in Ukraine has not yet had time to settle. The loved ones of the victims of the COVID-19 pandemic have not yet had time to mourn, and their tragedies have already been hailed by many as the mystification of hidden forces. The task that the representatives of the post-critical turn set themselves in relation to criticism is not to demolish but to decenter it. Any practice of criticism should be accompanied by meta-reflection, an awareness that of the limits of method of demystification, of its ritualized cognitive automatisms, and of the fact that the hermeneutic of distrust is only one of many positions that theory and interpretation can take towards the experienced phenomenon. From a post-critical perspective, criticism still has a great role to play. In the philosophy of religion, it has helped to bring the relationship between religion and metaphysics under creative consideration, to open up the philosophical thinking to new ways of approaching the phenomenon of the sacred. Without Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche, we would not have today the theological term in French phenomenology, or the orthodoxy or the idea of anatomism. And yet, from post-critical perspective, every suffix "de" in criticism, demystification, deconstruction, and denaturalization should be matched by the suffix reassembling, remaking, reinterpreting, rebuilding, reconnecting, restoring. As Paul Ricoeur writes, the dissolution of the myth as explanation is the necessary way to the restoration of the myth as a symbol. Thus, the time of restoration is not a different time from that of criticism. We are in every way children of criticism, and we seek to go beyond criticism by means of criticism, by criticism that is no longer reductive but restorative. Now comes "we wish to be called again," the last part of the citation of Paul Ricoeur. To be called is to find oneself in the field of effect of a signifying entity, a symbol, an appeal, a story, or even a computer game, which has the potential to transform us as individuals, and therefore grant access to our intimacy or a personal center. For this to become possible, we need a new sensibility, a cognitive position, an affective stance that does not forget the critical one, but does not allow it to dominate us. According to Rita Falski, this means that we should start asking ourselves new questions. In addition to what is your theory of power, what about violence, we should also ask, and what is your theory of attachment, what about law? The post-critical term directs its attention to those elements of our affective and cognitive attitudes that critical theory has missed: closeness, intimacy, attachment, fascination, curiosity, devotion, and care. It is no coincidence that thinkers such as Alain Badiou, Richard Kiernan, and Adam Hernas in recent years have devoted their major works to the themes of love, intimacy, and touch. Rita Falski put it directly when she says that after decades of focusing on what Greeks called the agon, the reality of conflict and domination, it is eros that would bind us, which is returning to grace. The monological eye fends up from the world by a cordon of security, looking with distrust at every intruder who crossed its orbit of subjectivity, is being replaced by an eye opening a window to spontaneous closeness, gently unlocking the door in anticipation of an encounter with other other. Thomas Hardy, whom I see as theologian inscribed in the post-critical term, writes, in faith, it is this existential encounter with an all-embracing history, the true nature of human existence is revealed, its openness. Theological anthropology, based on mystical experience, sees in this openness the very essence of human existence. Homo est capax Dei. Openness is an essential element of post-critical ethos, something that could be compared not only to an existential stance, but also to an ethical virtue. Richard Kern, in his book Atheism, Returning to God After God, calls it, after John Keats, a negative capability, the ability to stay mindful in the orbit of that which does not lend itself to our intellectual submission. It is a capacity for not knowing, patience that does not see the nervous reduction of mystery to something that is subservient to our concepts. A post-critical view of the phenomenon of faith, unlike the critical one, will not focus on the question what is the cognitive structure that makes religious ideas and illusions possible, or on behalf of which implicit forces and interests does faith perform. Rather, it will ask, as Thomas Hardy does, what kind of God can visit us after Auschwitz, Rome, and Bucha? What are the loci theologici, the places of contact with mystery that are available after the declaration, 150 years after the declaration about the death of God? So, what awaits us after the desert of criticism? Is it the erosion of symbols, stories, and the religious sensibility irreversible? To conclude my reading, I would like to share my own post-critical metaphor, which speaks not of leaving the desert, but of its gradual transformation. Religiousness as mycorrhiza. Mycorrhiza is a type of symbiosis between mycorrhizal fungi and plant roots. It is a mutually beneficial relationship in which the fungi provide the plants with an additional source of water and nutrients, such as phosphorus, and in return, the plant roots provide the fungi with photosynthetic products, mainly carbohydrates. After the critical uprooting of the great religious narratives, the new hope for faith and religion is to embrace the role of mycorrhiza, a subterranean structure that, in reaction to stories, toposes, and desires that are re-rooting themselves into the ground of our sensibility, provide a kind of exteriorization. Mycorrhizal religiousness responds with care to the process of rooting new post-secular sensibilities, entwines them, and opens them up to connections, relationships, and hidden values, and from purely secular perspectives seem buried and inaccessible. When I speak of the phenomenon of mycorrhizal entwining, I think of Father Gosgowicz, who gathers crowds, not only of believers, around the smallest parish in Warsaw, where he has allowed to take root for jazz concerts, art exhibitions, the work of sculptors, Earth Day celebrations, and shelters for refugees from Ukraine. No one can imagine the landscape of the parish without the abundance of forms of engagement that have taken root in it, and it works both ways, as mycorrhiza. Today, at the crossroads of religion, we should not have the illusionary hope that the way out of the desert of criticism might be a comeback to a lush wilderness of external narrative forms of religion, such as we saw before the era of distrust and critique. Mycorrhiza may seem an unspectacular metaphor. It grows slowly into the underground structures of our own world. Its processual and dialogical growth, it seems dependent and secondary. And yet, it might become a hidden nervous system through which post-secular culture has a chance to take root again in the desert and to reconnect with the entrenched layers of mystery. Desert is not our final destination, but it is still a place where we could be called again. Thank you very much.